for the sake of simplicity, I'll be referring to the difference of Gaussians as the dog from here on. A very low standard deviation on the blurring of the image itself lets us capture very fine details, even tiny subtle features like the lower eyelashes. We can bring out even more details by increasing the sharpness, which really helps define the hair. From here, the threshold settings will wildly change the output. With a higher white point, we can make it more dramatic, and we can also reduce the strength of the hyperbolic curve to get a smoother gradient. This thresholding function is cool and all, but we can technically run the dog through any function we'd like. The hyperbolic tangent is fairly limited in that we can only get a two-tone result or a slight gradient, but what if we want more tones than just black and white? If we send the dog through the same quantization function from my video on pixel art, we can get any number of tones we want. Personally, I think the three-tone looks the best if unaltered, but higher tone quantization pairs very well with one-bit dithering to give much more defined dither gradients. While Taylor Swift is very pretty, this is ultimately a pretty simple photo. How does the dog look on a more complex environment? Applying the dog to this photo with the same settings as our quantized Taylor Swift, the results aren't too great. The foliage close to the camera and the bridge look fine, but we can see that the dog has been reading way too much Junji Ito with those swirly artifacts in the distance. This is the fault of our edge tangent flow blur and subsequent line integral convolution smoothing. We can make the photo look much better by reducing the ETF blur to near zero, and the swirliness disappears, giving us a very nicely stylized image without any line integral convolution artifacts. But I find the contrast to be a bit too jarring in this render, so I think reducing it makes quite a big difference. I dogged a few more photos with a similar setup, and I think it's quite impressive how well the dog is able to preserve and stylize edges. But I can't shake off this feeling of regret for choosing high-frequency image stylization in front of all of those parameters. If I had chosen some other path, I would have surely obtained a quite different style. Perhaps then I could have found what's known as that perfectly stylized image. This marks the completion of our difference of Gaussians algorithm, but how do we get it to look as cool as possible? With so many parameters, the effect is quite daunting, but what happens if we try to simplify the image? Also, for the sake of simplicity, I'll be referring to the difference of Gaussians as the dog from here on. A very high standard deviation on the blurring of the image itself makes edges wider and fine details are discarded, which becomes more obvious when we increase the sharpness. Just as an experiment, let's see what happens if we max the blur settings on all 5 blurs. Well, that looks terrible. But it does demonstrate how much the other settings can change the output. Returning back to normal, the blur of the structure tensor has a major impact, especially when it approaches 0. If we juxtapose this with a maximum line integral convolution blur and a major increase in sharpness, we can then reduce the strength of our hyperbolic tangent thresholding